The morning the world watched the sea swallow a coast. People in small towns were still choosing breakfast. The earthquake had already rewritten the day, and the tsunami arrived like a hand turning a page, unfolding consequences nobody could yet fully read. Within hours, an evacuation order arrived, and the word spread like a cold wind down narrow streets. That order would change lives, uproot families, and set in motion a mass movement of people that lasted years. When the evacuation order first came, it felt surreal and urgent at the same time. People were told to leave their homes, their histories, and their routines without knowing when or if they could ever return. The initial instruction covered an area that was hard to imagine evacuated, and the scale became clear only after roads filled with cars and trains packed with faces. Those images of mass movement were not just transportation snapshots. They were portraits of sudden homelessness across a prosperous region. The scale of the evacuation was staggering and often improvised in real time. Hundreds of thousands of residents were told to leave homes across multiple municipalities, creating one of the largest peacetime displacements in recent memory. Families packed what they could carry and boarded buses, trains, and sometimes nothing but their own feet as they moved inland. The journey was long, uncertain, and marked by the constant fear of what had been left behind near reactors that had been damaged and smoldered in secrecy. Communication lines were strained and official messages changed over hours and days, creating confusion among those trying to escape. At first, the government and plant operators offered limited information, and many people relied on word of mouth to decide where to go. This breakdown in clarity amplified fear and fostered rumors that spread faster than any official bulletin. The lack of consistent guidance forced communities to create ad hoc leaders and networks, shifting the burden of safety onto neighbors and volunteers. The evacuation order itself evolved from a simple radius to a complex set of zones based on projected contamination. Initially, officials issued a 3-kilometer and then a 10-kilometer exclusion, which later expanded into a 20-kilometer mandatory evacuation and broader voluntary zones. Each adjustment left people scrambling to understand where they belonged and what to do with homes they could no longer enter. The map of displacement became a patchwork quilt of restrictions that split towns, families, and practical access to livelihoods. The physical logistics of moving so many people were enormous and deeply human at the same time. Buses, trains, private cars, and the kindness of strangers all contributed to the exodus, while shelters filled with mattresses, donated food, and volunteers offering comfort. People with mobility difficulties, elderly residents, and those with chronic illnesses required specialized support that was often in short supply. Coordinating medical transport and ensuring continuity of care became one of the most urgent and overlooked challenges of the evacuation. For many families, the hardest decision was what to bring and what to leave behind when the clock was ticking. Photographs, documents, and items of cultural importance were chosen under pressure, while heavy furniture and garden plots were abandoned to the elements. The loss of physical possessions mattered, but the loss of place, of the continuity of community rituals, struck deeper wounds. People describe empty houses that still felt inhabited by memories, making departure both practical and existential. Shelters became temporary cities and microcosms of broader social challenges within days of the evacuation. Schools, gymnasiums, and community centers held families together, while authorities attempted to coordinate shelter assignments and basic necessities. Those spaces revealed social resilience but also tensions around privacy, sanitation, and access to information. Long days in communal living highlighted the unevenness of recovery and the quiet endurance of those waiting to learn their fate. Children experienced the evacuation as a rupture in time and sense of safety, and their displacement echoed for years afterwards. Schools were closed or relocated, sports teams were disbanded, and routines that anchor childhood evaporated overnight. Parents tried to protect young minds while they navigated grief and practical struggles, often prioritizing shelter and schooling over long-term psychological support. The consequences would later surface as learning gaps, anxiety disorders, and a generation with fragmented memories of home. Elderly residents faced a particularly brutal choice between staying in familiar homes and moving into unknown shelters. Many older people refused to leave properties they had tended for decades, and those who left encountered new dangers related to mobility and medical care. The mortality rate among evacuated elderly populations rose in the months after displacement, driven not just by radiation concerns, but by broken care networks. The evacuation turned daily care routines upside down and in some cases made living conditions worse than the risks they were fleeing. Behind the scenes, a small army of responders and volunteers tried to make sense of priorities in real time. Municipal workers, firefighters, and community volunteers worked around the clock to inventory evacuees, distribute supplies, and maintain communication lines. These efforts were heroic but chronically under-resourced, and many local governments struggled with funding and logistical bottlenecks. That mismatch between need and capacity created both improvisational solutions and painful failures that would be debated for years. Information about radiation risk became a second emergency within the evacuation, complicating decisions and sowing distrust. Without clear, trusted data, families weighed conflicting reports and media coverage while trying to preserve health and property. The science of dose and long-term exposure is complex and often counterintuitive, which left many people vulnerable to worst-case narratives or false reassurances. That communication gap shaped choices about return and led to deep divisions between experts and affected communities. Contamination mapping and decontamination efforts became central to any hope of return, but they were slow and painstaking. Teams scrubbed homes, removed topsoil, and cleared debris in a process that blended technology, labor, and ritual. Even after visible cleanup, invisible anxieties remained about lingering contamination and food safety, complicating decisions to return home. For some residents, the house was cleaned and the land restored, but the social fabric of the town had already been irreparably altered. Long-term displacement settled in as months became years and temporary shelters became semi-permanent residences. Many evacuees found work in new cities or stayed with relatives far from the coast, making living arrangements that would last decades. Communities that once shared festivals, schools, and everyday life now existed in fragmented diaspora across towns and prefectures. That dispersion eroded traditional support structures and made it difficult to imagine the same communal life ever reforming. The economic cost of displacement extended beyond property loss to the collapse of local industries and small businesses. Fisheries, farms, and hospitality services lost both customers and the physical ability to operate within exclusion zones. Rebuilding economies required more than money. It required people to want to return and confidence that infrastructure would be reliable. Without schools, hospitals, and jobs, resettlement remained a theoretical possibility for many rather than a practical choice. Mental health emerged as a quiet but urgent crisis amid displaced populations, with trauma showing in ways that were slow to diagnose. Anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorders increased as people lived between what they had lost and what they might regain. Stigma around mental health and limited access to professional care compounded the problem, causing many to suffer in silence. Over time, community programs and NGOs attempted to address these invisible scars, but the pathway to recovery remained long and uneven. Compensation and policy responses attempted to provide redress, but often fell short of addressing deeper needs. Financial schemes offered to buy houses or provide living allowances were complicated by bureaucracy, varying eligibility, and contested values of land. Those legal and administrative battles were not just about money, but about dignity, recognition, and the right to decide what home means. For many, the compensation process itself became a new source of stress and conflict that echoed the original disaster. Media coverage shaped global perception of the evacuation, long before most people could understand its human detail. Dramatic images of abandoned towns and radiation suits traveled the world, creating strong narratives about catastrophe, danger, and negligence. Those narratives often prioritized symbolism and spectacle over long-term human experience, flattening complex stories into headline moments. When the cameras left, however, the slow work of recovery continued out of sight and without the same urgency. Local leaders and activists played a critical role in advocating for evacuees and preserving community cohesion. Grassroots groups organized services, documented testimonies, and pushed authorities to prioritize human needs over technical timelines. Their work created archives of memory and political pressure that influenced compensation and decontamination policies. These community efforts became the connective tissue for a dispersed population trying to maintain identity and voice. The question of return versus resettlement became a moral and practical dilemma for many families. Some residents waited years for official permission to return, believing the land to be part of their identity and livelihood. Others chose to rebuild elsewhere, creating new neighborhoods and new routines that sometimes flourished more quickly than the areas left behind. Those divergent choices split communities and families, and legacy debates about the right decision continued for decades. Schools and cultural institutions served as bellwethers for recovery, returning slowly, if at all, to exclusion zones. Reopening a school symbolized hope and a commitment to the future, but it required families to believe in the safety and viability of return. For many towns, the closure of a school represented a final rupture, because schools anchor not only education but intergenerational ties and daily rhythms. Rebuilding educational infrastructure became as important to community resilience as decontamination was to practical safety. Healthcare networks faced enormous strain trying to serve dispersed populations and aging evacuees. Hospitals in receiving areas became overcrowded, while local clinics near the coast were shuttered or under-resourced during the exclusionary period. Continuity of care for chronic illnesses and specialized treatments was disrupted, forcing patients into long travel or unsafe delays. These medical interruptions had concrete consequences for morbidity and mortality among vulnerable groups. International aid and scientific cooperation arrived, but with mixed reception among locals and officials alike. While some saw outside assistance as welcome expertise, others perceived it as intrusion or as commentary on national capacity. Scientific teams monitored radiation, advised on decontamination, and attempted to model long-term risks. But translating that work into public confidence remained difficult. The juxtaposition of global expertise and local pain complicated recovery relationships. The corporate role in the evacuation story, particularly that of the plant operator, proved controversial and consequential. Questions about preparedness, maintenance, and transparency became central to public trust and legal proceedings. Investigations would later scrutinize decisions and reveal systemic weaknesses that magnified the disaster's human toll. That corporate dimension turned a natural disaster into a combined technological and institutional crisis. Over time, some evacuated areas gained new life through deliberate reconstruction and strategic investment. Local governments offered incentives for businesses to return, rebuilt infrastructure, and marketed towns as safer and revitalized. Yet, even successful reconstruction could not instantly restore the intangible qualities of community, such as friendships and rituals lost during long displacement. Recovery took creative imagination as well as capital, and it required people willing to begin again amid complicated memories. Some residents returned and found familiar places changed in subtle and painful ways, while others discovered new opportunities in different cities. The act of returning was less triumphant homecoming, and more a negotiation between past and present. Practical matters like property rights, debt, and local services shaped those negotiations, and often favored those with resources to move back quickly. For those who could not return, the sense of abandonment and loss became a chronic condition rather than a temporary setback. Researchers studying long-term outcomes found that evacuation had multi-generational consequences that were not immediately obvious. Children displaced at early ages demonstrated educational and social differences compared to peers who remained in stable communities. Those patterns raised questions about intergenerational responsibility and the need for policies that address the long tail of displacement. The evacuation therefore became not only a historical event, but a living social experiment with ongoing implications. The legal and political fallout of the evacuation continued to reverberate in courts and parliaments. Lawsuits over compensation and liability exposed difficult truth about accountability in complex technological systems. Political debates centered on risk tolerance, energy policy, and how much trust citizens could place in institutions tasked with protecting them. These questions about governance and responsibility shaped policy reforms and public opinion for years afterward. Cultural responses to the evacuation emerged across art, literature, and memorials as people tried to make sense of loss through creativity. Museums and exhibitions preserved personal objects and stories to ensure memories would survive beyond headlines. These cultural artifacts helped communities process grief and preserve local identity, while also educating future generations. Memory work became part of recovery, shaping how the evacuation would be remembered and taught. The evacuation taught painful lessons about the limits of preparedness in the face of compounded disasters. An earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident combined to create cascading failures that no single plan could fully anticipate. Policymakers and emergency planners took those lessons seriously and began redesigning protocols, communication systems, and risk assessments. The aim was not to pretend disasters could be prevented, but to make human response more humane and effective when they occurred. Today, the legacy of the Fukushima evacuation is not only in empty houses and cleared fields, but in altered lives and collective memory. The displacement reshaped demographics, politics, and the intimate sense of what home means for thousands. Those human stories remain the most important record of the event, reminding policymakers that recovery metrics must include emotional and social repair. The evacuation is therefore both a technical case study and a moral test of how societies care for those most affected. As debates about energy policy continue worldwide, the Fukushima evacuation remains a cautionary tale about the human cost of technological failure. It asks how societies balance progress, risk, and the value of places people call home. That question resonates today as governments confront climate change and infrastructure resilience, because disasters do not only test machinery but also social contracts. How we respond to displacement reveals the strength of those contracts and the depth of our compassion. In the years since the evacuation, some towns have returned to a form of life, while others remain hollow and awaiting decisions. The balance between return and renewal continues to be negotiated by residents, officials, and future generations. For those who lost everything, recovery means more than rebuild. It means recognition and a future that honors their choices and sacrifices. The long arc of this evacuation shows that rebuilding trust takes as long as rebuilding infrastructure. If we look closely, the evacuation's most enduring lesson is about human fragility and resilience working together. People can be uprooted by forces beyond their control, but they also have the capacity to reorganize, care for each other, and rebuild meaning over time. That paradox should guide how governments plan for disasters, emphasizing not only engineering solutions, but also social policies that protect dignity. The evacuation of Fukushima therefore remains a story of loss, adaptation, and the slow recovery of community. The human cost is often measured in numbers, but behind each statistic is a life altered in ways both small and profound. Families split across cities, elders who never returned, children who grew up between homes. These are the threads of an enduring social fabric that was frayed by the disaster. To remember those people is to insist that recovery includes mental health, social cohesion, and the ability to choose where to live. That broader conception of rebuilding makes the evacuation not only a historical fact, but a continuing moral imperative. There is also a practical takeaway about transparency and communication when public safety is at stake. Clear, timely, and honest information reduces fear and enables better decision-making. And that principle applied to the Fukushima evacuation could have saved many hours of anguish. Investments in robust emergency communication systems and local empowerment are cheap compared to the human costs of confusion. Those institutional lessons are among the most actionable outcomes of a painful chapter in modern disaster history. Looking forward, the legacy of the evacuation will continue to inform how communities prepare for compound disasters. Climate-related storms, rising seas, and aging infrastructure all make the experience of Fukushima relevant to cities and towns worldwide. Preparing for the next disaster means combining technical foresight with social policies that protect the most vulnerable. If we adopt that integrated approach, the memory of Fukushima can become a generator of humane resilience rather than only a monument to loss. The evacuation changed laws, rebuilt neighborhoods, and rewired national debates about energy and safety. But its deepest effect was on people and identity. Where once simple daily routines anchored lives, displacement inserted uncertainty into memory and belonging. That transformation matters because places are repositories of culture and relationships. And when they are emptied, the loss is both practical and existential. The Fukushima evacuation thus challenges us to consider loss in its fullest human dimension. Years later, survivors and their descendants still sift through decisions about return, compensation, and reinvention of home. Some find new communities and create new meanings, while others keep the hope of return alive across generations. The ongoing nature of these decisions shows that an evacuation is rarely an isolated event. It is a process that continues through courtrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. That continuity is the reason the evacuation should remain part of civic education and public planning. In the end, the evacuation of Fukushima is a mirror for how modern societies handle sudden, large-scale risk. It reveals strengths in communal care and glaring gaps in institutional responsibility, and the tension between those two truths is instructive. As policymakers and citizens, we must learn to weigh technological ambition against social protection, to plan for worst-case complexity while preserving human dignity. That is the philosophical twist at the heart of this story, and it is why the evacuation matters beyond Japan. If this video gave you a new perspective on evacuation, displacement, and resilience, consider subscribing for more stories that connect history to human lives. The evacuation of Fukushima is a reminder that behind every statistic is a person trying to find the next right step. If you'd like to learn more, check the linked sources and survivor testimonies. And share this video to keep the conversation alive. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe.